Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 9th or 10th installment of Pentesters Chat here with the fine folks on Sprocket Security and our service delivery pen testing team. My name is Nate, and over the next half hour, 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking along with some of my coworkers here on single sign-on and some of the pros and cons, and maybe if we're lucky, a war story or two on some fun encounters that we've come across on certain engagements. Before we get going with all of that, I think it's always just a good idea to kind of do a level set introduction so that folks on the call, which by the way, it's always good to see some familiar names, folks on the call, to get familiar with some of the testers here that we have on the team. So, like I mentioned, my name is Nate. I've been with Sprocket for a number of years now, 4.5, I think. And I am on the service delivery team, primarily doing network-based and web application penetration testing. I'll just do it clockwise from my perspective. So, Ron, if you want to just give a quick introduction.
Hi, I'm Ron Edgerson, principal penetration tester at Sprocket, and I think I've been here about 4 months now. And I do everything network penetration testing, web apps, all of it. So
Yeah, I see Nicholas next. So,
Okay, there we go. Awesome. Nicholas Anastasi, the Director of Technical Operations and primarily a penetration tester here at Sprocket Security. Do a bit of everything like Ron. Been at Sprocket for close to 6 years now, and then kind of located near our main office in Madison. And I'll kick it over to Nick.
Thanks, Nicholas. Nick Hours here, senior penetration tester with Sprocket. Been here same amount of time as Ron. We started right around the same time. So we've been rocking and rolling here and getting up to speed with the Sprocket ways and having a lot of fun. Based out of Buffalo as one of the remote testers here, and look forward to chatting today a little bit about single sign-on.
good deal. So, for those who this may be your first Pentesters Chat, like I mentioned, I see some familiar names. We generally like to keep this fairly lighthearted and casual. So if you have any questions at all during our talking, we like to try and do our best to stay on top of those. So please feel free to use the chat function. Just make sure that you are sending your chat to us as well so that we can see that. And yeah, I mean, without further ado, why don't we'll dive right into the single sign-on pros and cons. I don't think it really begs a super deep dive introduction. I think everybody is mostly somewhat familiar with single sign-on, if not the various technical implementations, at least the concept, right? We're all familiar with going to a social media page, or nowadays it seems like every single website and app, and everybody wants you to log on with Google or Gmail. Everybody wants you to log on with Microsoft. All of these other, these service providers. It's a technical term in the SSO landscape. And yeah, you're right. You log in once, you sign on a single time, and then you're authenticated to a whole host of other related systems and whatnot. And so, obviously, I think the most salient pro to all of that, right, is reducing the friction for end users. Right, you log in one time and you don't need to enter in your password 1,000 different times. As security-minded professionals, all on the call, we immediately hear and think a convenience. That's usually means on the other end of that is security trade-offs and implications, right? So I think, there's, without naming specific sort of attacks and whatnot, that is always something that jumps out at us, right? I'm sure everybody would agree to some extent. If we hear, oh, that makes it easy for the user, that probably means that there's, some level of increased security risk, which if you do any amount of research or homework, so any type of history, that is certainly the case, right? Maybe not necessarily as much in attacking single sign-on systems, though there certainly are vulnerabilities in that, right? But anytime there's a there seems to be a trade-off there. And so, I mean, does anybody want to raise their hand and disagree with that? I feel
Not disagree, but more so, I think we talked about like ease of use for end users. It was also driven by ease of use for IT administrators, just because it was years and years of managing credentials on multiple systems for users. So initial kind of implementation of that, right, was LDAP and kind of centralized directory services, and now we've transitioned into a single sign-on and kind of paid identity providers. Just to kind of expand on what Nate said a little bit, like the game with security, I think, is like walking the line between reducing user friction while maintaining security. I've said this in actually like a recent talk and also in remediation sections of findings that we've written that you got to be careful there. Like what makes it easy for users can also, be less secure generally, or in some cases. So I'll say, right, when we're talking about single sign-on, there's a few different implementations or two primary ones I think we're referencing, and Ron and Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's kind of cloud based single sign-on providers where you pay a third party to manage your identity provider and kind of facilitate access to different apps. And then alternatively, on the other side, there's not necessarily home-rolled or like in-house single sign-on providers, but open source frameworks and things like that you can stick in front of your web applications to provide kind of SSO capabilities and security features. You'll see it with companies that provide SaaS apps and things like that. They'll one have their own identity provider that might provide you access to a bunch of different apps and services that they offer. Or they'd allow you to kind of plug in SAML configurations to hook that application up to cloud services. The one kind of big talking point here that I think spawned some of this conversation was the idea that no longer do you need to play the account hopping game where you compromise a single account and then you have to find more credentials and compromise another and another. By the time that, you've compromised a single domain user account, if, for example, in Okta or O365, you've hooked that up to Jira and Know Before training and all these different kind of solutions, then you have access to those services as well. Ron, Nick, any other kind of thoughts there for background on this stuff?
Maybe not so much background. I do have a good, I guess, story. I don't know if it's too soon to get into a war story, but I think it seems to tie in perfectly. You just did a great intro to kind of what set the stage for his story. I was in an engagement. It had the full set of scope. It had social engineering, internal, external, some on-prem stuff, etc. Successfully fished a whole bunch of credentials. Let's just say, I don't know, 15, 30, somewhere in there. And externally wanted to use them to log into any of the web applications we'd identified, right? They had like VMware Horizon for remote desktops or virtual desktop infrastructure, your SharePoint, your whole Microsoft suite of different various applications, etc. And so Horizon's a good target because a lot of times those virtual desktops get you basically a foothold into the environment from outside, depending on, how they have their network set up, obviously. But so we're like, all right, let's get into VMware with one of these credentials. Tried to log in, hit Duo. To your point on convenience, it's really convenient if you're logging into two-factor and you want to just hit that accept button instead of moving codes around. So pretty well-known tactic for us pen testers is the Duo push fatigue, right? I send a push, wait, see if they accept it. Maybe they don't. Try it a second time. Maybe the end user goes, this is weird. It's annoying. It's whatever. Hits OK. Boom. Now we're past two-factor. So I'm into VMware Horizon. I check out their two virtual desktops. They had a Linux and a Windows one, and had some stuff to look at there. But I was like, okay, let's see if we can get another user to accept a push because odds are this is like mandatory two-factor. And we went to log out of VMware, and instead of going back to the Microsoft, I think I may have skipped that. This is all front-ended with Microsoft Online or Entra or whatever you want to whatever Microsoft flavor of online single sign-on was being used here. Logging out of VMware, we expect we're going to land back at the Microsoft "You've been signed out" page, but instead we land at the VMware Horizon login page. I'm like, it didn't. That's weird. So I take a different phished credential, pop it in, and we get right back into VMware. No two-factor or anything. So I guess the moral of the story is you have to kind of think about how you manage those login sessions just as much as how you manage the log out process. Every other app they had behind Microsoft, when you logged out, it logged you all the way out, but there was one exception for VMware. So the risk there is, now two factors essentially bypassed for one app, as long as you get one person to get you past that single sign-on. So it's not me knocking any single sign-on provider. It's not me knocking VMware. I'm sure it was just one of those weird configuration things. You've added complexity with the goal of simplicity, and it kind of backfired a little bit there. So just an interesting story. I don't know if anybody's ever come across something like that before, but
I think it's interesting that it should be no surprise to any of the defenders, any of the blue team, anybody who's ever worked in enterprise, sort of that side of the fence, that again, all of that, right? I know we're talking about single sign-on here, but again, the weakest link there seemed to, of course, be the individual person, you doing the successful fish. And we can certainly come back to that, but Nathan in the chat said that we should celebrate the fact that SSO documentation has evolved quite well. In the early days, you had to figure it out. And I don't think that can be overstated, right? I think that's a huge boon to the industry. I'm sure there's a number of organic driving factors towards that. You kind of see the same with other parallels in the industry, like browser security, right? For a long time, half the web was still on HTTP, it was unencrypted, and you can take a look at the trend lines and say, like, okay, as major organizations start to influence and push certain standards and methodologies, things, quote unquote, get more secure as we move towards a more encrypted web. Now you have, quote unquote, more secure with things like single sign-on. So I just wanted to make that, wanted to give that a thumbs up. But as for that attack path, I think we're all familiar with the push fatigue. But outside of that, I think in large part, the old adage, attackers really don't have to get lucky once. You just have to get lucky with finding that weird sort of offshoot of not getting totally logged out in the VDI, which was, ended up working. Nicholas seems to be disagreeing, so let's hear what he else to say.
I don't want to turn this into like an MFA bypass conversation, but I'd love to talk about it. One of my favorite things with the Horizon in particularly was, let's say they have SSO in front of it and you've compromised like two setup credentials or sets of credentials. Once you push fatigue your way into Horizon, using that user's desktop, resolve the Horizon instance on the internal network and it doesn't have SSO in front of it, get a cookie for a user that way, and then put it in your browser outside the network and continuously like refresh the page, and you don't have to deal with MFA anymore because that session is just sitting active. I also heard a story, and this kind of talks about with like single sign-on and trusting. You have these edge cases, right? I've been told by testers when you're working like huge enterprises to use proxies out of India, because a lot of these very, very, very large enterprises use third-party IT companies to help them manage things. And because the internet is so unreliable and electrical grid and things in India is like that, they've just gotten rid of MFA for those users. And so if you try to log in from there, MFA is just bypassed completely. It's I've never tried that, but I hope I get the chance to one day. It's like with these SSO services too, it's it's easy to set up. There's all this kind of, you're gonna have to create exceptions. It's just figuring out how you do that. I also will like see things along the lines of you're doing like on-prem AD syncs up into Azure, and then you're setting like conditional access policies and things like that for those groups. and it's a lot harder to keep visibility on like the size and scope of a group in AD as opposed to Azure nowadays, and so you can end up in weird situations where you have exceptions to these multi-factor authentication requirements. But I saw that someone had a question. Our VP of IT is pushing very hard to use only Microsoft SSO for every business app, and it's extremely secure. It's hard to say, right? Like, I do think it's dependent on what you're using today. If you've got Exchange on-prem and then VMware Horizon sitting out there, some other VDI and a VPN and that sort of thing, it's yes, you don't have to necessarily protect the endpoints anymore because the SSO provider will be sitting in front of it. But again, like you compromise one account, if that user is in the right groups, you can make it very secure, but it gets really complex, and so you end up in these kind of weird fringe situations. So, Elizabeth, I'm not gonna make a hard statement one way or another, but really depends on the current tech stack and auth and that sort of thing. If it's more secure or less secure for you, I would say as well. And guys, call me shut up here in a second, because I'll keep talking. Like most of the time with single sign-on services, right? You're putting you're basically only allowing the external version of that app. So let's say you have the VMware Horizon app sitting on the internet, and then you hook up Okta to it. There's IP allow listing to only allow that Okta to communicate with that VMware Horizon instance, or like or Cisco SSL VPN, that sort of thing. With all of the exploits flying out there for edge devices and VDIs and that sort of thing, you also reduce attack surface, or you don't reduce it, you shift it to O365. So that's I guess there's a pro there in a sense, but yeah. Ron, I've been talking a ton. All of us have any thoughts here?
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to talk about where we get into insecure, or how people set up their implementation, which could be insecure by default. And just to give a scenario, it was a red team engagement I was on with one of my other coworkers. And I won't say the name of the service, but I will say that we were able to do an adversary in the middle, and it had cache poisoning. But again, like you won't know these things. A lot of times you have, I say like a lot of people think, like I'll just give an example. You have a parser and you think a parser is supposed to do this validation for you, but if you don't validate the parser, that's not the parser's job. So the same thing here is like if you're not doing the correct validations or implementation, then you wind up seeing yourself in a whole world of trouble. So in here, we were able to not only phish users, but able to use cache poisoning to actually trick users into going to our malicious server and then get their credentials and then just harvest all of those credentials using that through IDP and any other federated system. But again, it goes back to, being able to do the correct implementation and not thinking because you get something right out of the box, it's going to work. And another scenario is like, people think once you get an authorization code, you don't have to validate that. You need to make sure that that's invalidated. I see that a lot of times where a user are not invalidating that one-time token, and you can replay that token consistently. So yes, the complexity might be high if an attacker can get it, but an attacker will eventually. So if an attacker is doing an adversary in the middle attack or a man in the middle, whatever, if you don't validate that, you give the attacker more of a chance to be able to get that token, replay it, and use it across your organization without you even knowing. So again, a lot of times I don't see a lot of clients using defenses as far as like an HMAC, where they can actually validate whether the integrity of those requests as well, along with IDP. So you get to a point where you may not see that the attacker is actually laterally moving through your environment just using IDP, because you probably didn't use that method or think you needed that. But that's just another way to actually be able to tell whether something has been modified by doing that as well. But those are a lot of things I've seen that a lot of people think that every IDP will work right out of the box and don't put in or implement the right mitigations or validations for these systems. So Those are things I've seen constantly, especially not validating signature for federated systems like SAML, where, I think, Nate, you probably had XML injection on one of the systems where you're able to call back. I mean,
Good guess, yeah.
I've seen on these systems where they're not validating. I mean, you can pull out secret keys out of different JWT tokens, things like that, because they're using known public keys. I mean, these are just common things that we see commonly. And I just think that a lot of time, even though IDP is getting better, I think it's us as a security group or folks in general, and the defenders, we're not actually doing a great job at making sure that we're validating these things. Not saying we're not getting better, but I think that we also have to make sure that we're validating everything, and that we're not depending on IDP or any SSO to do the things for us. So that's some of the common things I still see. Even though we're getting better, way better than we were back then, I still see a lot of those common mistakes. But at least one thing I don't see is common, I don't know about you guys, is open redirects. I remember that used to be common. That's that is one thing I'm glad that we've done a really great job at, is because that was like, you go there, you see a redirect, and you could just take control of the thing. But
You mean like in the open redirect URI param, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah, I've seen that. And then the other one I used to see a good amount that I don't really see anymore is like the open registry endpoint, where you could just like register your own application and tie it into something. It's just like I reported that in a few bug bounties years ago, and I test for it still to this day every time, but I just don't see it anymore. So not a lot of these.
It's funny I got something, I subscribe to a number of different like security related newsletters and whatnot. 2 days ago, there was a vulnerability in some OAuth implementation on double URL encoding some parameter within the normal sort of assertion, right? So it's like Ron just said, this used to happen back in the day. It did to some degree, but then, like all things, right, it remains evergreen because of, the impact of being able to exploit all of this stuff. And so I wanted to ask the group, though, given and also for anybody on the call, right, if you feel the need to chime in here too, right, we've got a fairly large collective number of years and experience being information security practitioners, IT professionals. If I were to ask, like, just general sense, are we in a better is the trade-off worth it for where we're at right now with single sign-on? All other things being equal. So meaning, I don't wanna go back in time to when single sign-on was not as popular. I just mean, if you take away single sign-on now, for the average organization and for the average end user, is security as however you wish to define it, as long as it remains consistent, is security improved? Like, are we in a better spot as a vertical, right? Like, are we in a better spot, or is it kind of like that we're carrying too much stuff, and because we're getting too much, things are getting too complicated, are we like, okay, is this actually solving anything, right? Or are we verifiably in a better spot? And sometimes it's just kind of hard to determine that because of things like really high impact vulnerabilities. What do you guys? There's no right or wrong answer. Nicholas may disagree on this as well.
Not at all. I'm just gonna get on my soapbox. I'm gonna apologize to everybody like proactively here. Like, I personally think we're better, but I also think that I was just about to post a link in the chat. There's this an SSO tax and a security tax that's levied basically on all of these organizations, whether they're giant or small. And the smallest organizations are the ones you're seeing get ransomware. Everybody is buying into either O365, Okta, that sort of thing, and then they use these additional kind of SaaS apps, or they host their own, right? I think there's a lot of companies taking advantage of this fact, at least. And so even though we're better from I can't go spray Exchange, Duo's there, it can't protect the EWS endpoint, boom, you've pulled mail and blah 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 blah. Like the easy stuff is gone. But I think organizations now have to play this game with these giant enterprise SaaS providers where they're paying crazy amounts of money to protect their end users, which um, one part being part of a business, I understand that. On the other, kind of from a third party standing back, right? Like, I think it's not necessarily you should bake security into your products and your SSO implementation and everything by default, not force companies to pay $5 extra per user per month and that sort of thing to protect their accounts. And so it's it's yeah. Overall, I guess to answer Nate's question, I think we're in a better spot because at least my job has gotten harder even in the past like 3 or 4 years when I started. Like I said, I saw Exchange on literally every engagement I had, and that was a 2 hour path to maybe 8 hour path to DA most of the time. So it's like now you get lucky if you guess creds. Okta's nearly impossible to password spray. O365 is getting exceedingly difficult with things like smart lockout. And then other IdPs and SSO providers, we've had to write like headless Chrome sprayers for them where they're basically launching a browser and entering credentials and things like that, which is very, eh, it's time prohibitive for testers. The game or the thing we always talk about, and it kind of got mentioned there for a second, like you're good assume you're gonna get popped. It's how much can you slow the attacker down and how much what are your capabilities to detect that attacker. And so when I look at the landscape today, right, these external SSO providers, they slow us down, at least the ones provided by like cloud services or enterprises like Microsoft and Okta, and then capabilities to detect. While they cost money, they're baked in by default. Whereas with Exchange or Horizon or something like that, you had to implement an internal SIM, feed your logs on, train your staff, that sort of thing. If you pay Microsoft enough money, they'll tell you when an account gets compromised just based on certain indicators. So overall, right, like we're slower, and I think generally less effective in like identity-based attacks than we used to be because of SSO implementations. Ron and Nick, though, I'm not sure if you guys have other thoughts. That's kind of I'm stepping down off the soapbox, and yeah, I get excited every time Nate talks. It seems like here because
You guys are the smart ones. I'm just here to sort of feed through the interesting stuff, and then you guys take it.
Professor here. But I'm 50-50. Coming from someone who's been a defender, a developer, and system administrator, all of that. I do agree that we've gotten better with all of the different technologies and just doing that defense in depth, taking that strategy. I think we have gotten better, but the thing is, I feel like the attackers, even if we get an inch as a defender, the attackers are always an inch further. So it's like they learn to adapt. So now they're leveraging automation, AI, all different things to get around those things and defenses that we have. So it's harder as a defender to try to continuously keep attackers out, even if you have SSO. There's always other ways to get around different things. Maybe I'm not looking to grab credentials. Maybe I'm looking to see how secure your token is and can I replay it? Are you validating? Do you have the right defenses against that to stop me? Maybe your SSO provider, this third party, is not secure as you think. Now you add that and inherit that issue where they have insecure caching or insecure synchronization, different issues that allow us to do different things and bypass those defenses. So I think with the current state of AI and attackers automating things, it kind of it makes them gets them further than we are. And as a defender, you have to continuously stay on your toes. So the biggest thing I would say that I like that Nicholas said is basically not only, I guess basically not only having those defensive depths in that technology, but I think the biggest thing is being able to respond and detect. Get better at detection and response. And I think we'll be a lot further ahead. And that was something I focused on when I was a defender or security engineer, is being able to respond quickly and detect these things. And I had a lot of things set up, and we use Splunk. It doesn't matter what you decide. I don't want to get into that war, but I had a lot of different things in response set up so I could check those things: canary tokens, honeypots, documents set up where they were set in places to see if anybody would trigger those alerts. So, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people are doing that, but I think if we can get better at response and detection, I think that'll put defenders ahead of the game as far as the attackers. But again, with the current state of how things are changing and how attackers are adapting, I think they always stay an inch ahead of us. So, but I do think we're a little bit better, but it's a 50-50 game.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you just said, Ron. I really don't have anything to disagree on that. And I think we're right about at 30 minutes. We have some time for questions here. I'm going to mess up everything we talked about with this one last sentence really quick. I'm just going to flip the whole thing, right? What do we tell people not to do when they have a bunch of websites and they have to create a username and password for all these websites?
Don't create the same one.
And what are you doing when you use single sign-on? You know,
Yeah, I mean, for manager, instead of you, Nick, instead of you proselytizing on the last answer, why don't you take Lucian and Ian's question on
Sure. Yeah.
take on password managers, and are they as good? Maybe some quick parallels, and then we can get to the to Nathan's questions too. But I assume that you can see them in the chat. If you could just repeat.
Yeah, let me see here. You said, what is your take on password managers? Are they as good or even better single sign-on for securing multiple accounts? Yeah, everybody really, I was hesitant. Eventually I broke down. I was like, all right, there's just too many accounts, too many things nowadays. Need the password manager. Became a LastPass guy, about a year before they had their big breach. So then I'm like, see, this is why I wasn't a big fan of this. This is exactly what I was worried about, sort of thing. And it didn't really turn into any, for me personally, I didn't end up having any issues related to that breach. So I guess at the end of the day, their security still held enough to keep my stuff protected. Again, personal experience there. But there's probably a million shades of variance to answer the question, what's right for you. Some people might say, well, you don't want to write down all your passwords on a sticky note or in a book, because what if somebody finds that? For me personally, I work from home. There's really not too many people looking over my shoulder. If my passwords were on a sticky note, they're not for the record. If they were, I don't think there's many people who are going to happen to walk by and see them. So a password manager works. Maybe writing them down works. I think it's hard to say what the future is going to be like when you say, I'm going to go with maybe this password provider or this password manager now. So I know that's a non-answer.
No, I think.
But
Well, Nick, turn your camera around and show us your monitor to prove the
which monitor? No.
As you were talking there, Nick, too, somebody needs to make a meme about what's the Gigabrain meme where it turns into the blue whatever, about what if you put SSO in front of your password manager for your company? Like, I see that happen a lot, and I'm just like, okay. And anyways,
I was just gonna Ian in the chat, and don't worry, Nathan, we'll get back to it because I want to touch on that too. Ian followed up and said, what do you think about the philosophy that's tossed around that SSO leads to more secure passphrases, which is almost like sort of in a sense what Nicholas is talking about, or I feel like there's some congruent arguments to be made on using a password manager versus trying to remember a single password, or do what we're all familiar with doing, and doing single sort of last byte rotations and incrementations. Password 123. Sorry, you need to make it longer. Okay, password 1234. Well, you need a special character. Password 1234 exclamation, right? Like, is that any more secure than making that your single sign-on password, or that your password manager master password? There's obviously going to be some technical differences in feasible attacks, but I think philosophically that's kind of the same, right? I mean, you're ultimately putting all your eggs, so to speak, in one basket, and you've got one thing to go up against. So you better make sure, right, that the password that you're using to protect all of these resources is pretty strong, and single sign-on, I think, works I would assume that the argument is not that different, but I'd be happy if anybody else has, or Ian, if you're still on the call, if there's a particular piece of like an article or anything that uh, made you think of that question, maybe that we're missing some important context, or if that's just was a curiosity. But I would be interested to hear how the opposite side of that, like how it decreases overall security having a weaker password for single sign-on, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So, um, and then we've got one more question from Nathan. It's not a good question just because we shared the same name, but he did say that a weak conditional access policy can be a downside to single sign-on and just as bad, which is like, yeah, huge very much agree, because it can sort of lead you into that false sense of security, right? You have the conditional access policy, things that we recommend customers enable and engage with and work with all of the time. But I think Ron sort of touched on this earlier, there's almost nothing in the security world, let alone the real world. We're all familiar with vendors. There's almost nothing that exists where you can just plug it in and be good to go, right? You've always got to tune, you've always got to figure out edge cases, there's always more work to do. And you typically get, bit in the butt if you fall under to the assumption that you can just set it and forget it. Or in the case of or in the case of conditional access policies, just sort of use the default version. It's like, oh, conditional access policies, those are good, right? And they are, but they're only as good as the policy that you use to craft and create specific to your organization. And if you don't do that, like Ron mentioned before, if you don't do the configuration out of the box, then you're actually making things worse, because now you've just reduced the barrier to entry on attacking your single sign-on system versus the other way around. So I very much agree on that too, Nathan.
Just paying Microsoft more money, and
Or that
if they
you can always
care of it for you. Everybody has, they can afford it. It's fine. One thing I realized we didn't even get the chance to talk about here was, I'm gonna drop the link for everybody because we'll have to dip, but the signing key theft from Microsoft in like late UG3 to BF24, where they just pwned a bunch of organizations off of stealing that key, and then SSO became junk. I think it's, we were talking about it a little bit earlier, the complexity and things here, and also trusting. Gosh, I'm gonna get clipped, and people are gonna send this to Microsoft employees of me just. And I'm like every other security or penetration tester, honestly, so it's fine. But there's other risks associated with things. I highly recommend everybody read through that PDF. It's a little critical of Microsoft, but it kind of showcases like worst case scenario for attacks, I think, against SSO providers and IdPs in general. Also saw something from Ian here. User password fatigue and makes them more willing to use better passwords or even super magical. Ian, there's a psychological game to passwords, I think, that we've all been playing for a really long time. You like to hope that end users will increase password complexity. One thing I'll say that I see a lot more nowadays than even guessing a user's bad password that they set for themselves. Instead, I'm going to point the finger at IT and setting the default password for new users to password or something like that, and then they don't change it. I honestly haven't. It's been a while since I've guessed like summertime 2024 exclamation point. It's more like company name and all lowercase, and that user's never set up MFA before. That you'd like to hope, kind of with the psychological nature of SSO and only having to sign in once, that they would increase complexity, and generally I think they do. but you also run into sorry guys. You also have to run into kind of these other situations where somebody slips up and in the IT department, and then you also have the same level of access. So once you pop that account, so yeah. Do we have till 45 here, guys? 12:45, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, I'll kick it to anybody else. I'm gonna stop talking because I could ramble about this for like hours probably. So nicking around, I guess. If you guys have any closing thoughts.
I'm just making sure there's no questions we missed. Because I don't think I have anything else. At least not another 3-minute, bit here. I think we got everything though.
All right. Well, in that case, everybody who's still on the call, thank you so much for hanging out with us on this Friday afternoon. We will certainly be back. If we don't see the same faces, always feel free to drop us a line, and hope everybody has a great day. Thanks again for joining, and have a great weekend.
Have a good one.
Take care, all.